ProPublica recently published this shocking investigation that revealed that ICE and the federal agents that work with them have detained at least 170 American citizens during their immigration enforcement actions. They accuse many of the citizens of, quote, obstructing or interfering with enforcement, even of assault. And they only had those charges then fall apart under any kind of scrutiny, going past the bluster, as you said. Here in Chicago, we know that there have been multiple U.S. citizens who were reportedly detained during an immigration raid. Can you just talk a little bit about how the aggressive tactics of the administration are violating the rights of everybody? And again, a reminder that due process rights accrue to everybody. But can you just talk about that for anyone who might be watching the live stream and wondering, how does this affect me? I'm not an immigrant. I'm not, whatever label they might want to attach to that.
Absolutely. And you only have to look at two of the many pretty well publicized incidents over the last few weeks of very broad-based raids in Chicago to see that many U.S. citizens, for example, are swept up in these raids. There was a military-style attack on a South Shore apartment building, a 130-unit building that you mentioned, Member Jayapal, in your opening remarks, where they simply rounded people up, according to reports, and asked questions later. Now, law enforcement is supposed to work the opposite way. It's supposed to be targeted. You're supposed to get a warrant for a particular person who you have reason to believe has committed a crime and go over that person. Go over to find that person pursuant to a warrant. You're not supposed to essentially stage a hostage operation where you round people up and then release the people that you don't want after zip tying them in the back of U-Hauls for a few hours. They were zip tying children.
Thank you all so much. I know this is hard to even compress what we have to say because there's so much, and I deeply appreciate all the personal stories and the work that all of you are doing. We're now going to proceed under the 5-minute rule for questions, and I think we're going to have somebody sit right up here because we don't have a timer like we normally do. So this is Morgan. Thank you, Morgan, for being our human timer and helping us to make sure we stay on time so we can get out to the hearing, to the press conference on time. All right, I'm going to start with mine. Ms. Jesus Alejandre, the Trump administration keeps making these claims that those of you who are doing rapid response work are somehow assaulting ICE or standing in the way of impeding ICE. Can you just set the record straight for us and tell us about what the rapid response networks are doing and the work that you're doing to support communities who are under attack and being terrorized by ICE?
Rapid responders are regular people. Like, clearly, this is our weapon, and this one. This is what we document one. We don't know who's coming into community. They're masked and unmarked cars, often looking like they bought something off of Amazon, like they bought a uniform off of Amazon. So we don't know. So there's an alert that goes out, right? So you hear people honking horn, and these are just regular Chicagoans, right? Some people have gone through training around what does an ICE agent look like and what does a Customs and Border Patrol person look like, right? But often they don't look like any of that, right? And so these are folks who've been trained just to know, and also to know the rights, right? And how to try to stay calm in a situation, to remind everyone, regardless of their immigration status, what are the constitutional rights. And the impeding, right? They will say our presence is impeding. Right, our yelling is impeding,
right?
And
you're
our
documenting so that we
they don't want to be documented because everything that they're doing is illegal, it's unconstitutional, it's violent, and it's dangerous. And so the mere fact of us just being present on our porches yelling, they're saying that that's impeding, and it's not. We have the right to do all of those things, and our footage is being used in court, right? And they obviously don't want that. However, again, what we need is enforcement of those court rulings as well in our community.
Thank you so much. And I appreciate, Mr. Fee, you're saying that we're, doing a shadow hearing, but we're bringing light to this because I think that documentation is a critical piece of the court records. ProPublica recently published this shocking investigation that revealed that ICE and the federal agents that work with them have detained at least 170 American citizens during their immigration enforcement actions. They accuse many of the citizens of, quote, obstructing or interfering with enforcement, even of assault. And they only had those charges then fall apart under any kind of scrutiny, going past the bluster, as you said. Here in Chicago, we know that there have been multiple U.S. citizens who were reportedly detained during an immigration raid. Can you just talk a little bit about how the aggressive tactics of the administration are violating the rights of everybody? And again, a reminder that due process rights accrue to everybody. But can you just talk about that for anyone who might be watching the live stream and wondering, how does this affect me? I'm not an immigrant. I'm not, whatever label they might want to attach to that.
Absolutely. And you only have to look at two of the many pretty well publicized incidents over the last few weeks of very broad-based raids in Chicago to see that many U.S. citizens, for example, are swept up in these raids. There was a military-style attack on a South Shore apartment building, a 130-unit building that you mentioned, Member Jayapal, in your opening remarks, where they simply rounded people up, according to reports, and asked questions later. Now, law enforcement is supposed to work the opposite way. It's supposed to be targeted. You're supposed to get a warrant for a particular person who you have reason to believe has committed a crime and go over that person. Go over to find that person pursuant to a warrant. You're not supposed to essentially stage a hostage operation where you round people up and then release the people that you don't want after zip tying them in the back of U-Hauls for a few hours. They were zip tying children at that building. And that's only one example. There was a work crew at a cemetery in Forest Park that was recently gassed. They had their belongings taken from them. One of them had to go to the hospital while still shackled for hours and was released into the street in a hospital gown, without his keys, without his wallet, with no way to even get into his own house. And he didn't even know what, if anything, he had done wrong. This is a U.S. citizen as well. So this is not affecting some small band of people. And if folks think that they are not at risk, I'm afraid they're sorely mistaken.
Thank you so much. I am now going to, my time has expired, so I'm now going to recognize our members, and we're going to start with my colleague from the state of Illinois who's been such a help in organizing this hearing, Mr. Garcia.
In that hearing room, the air was heavy, not just with words, but with the weight of truth. Representative Pramila Jayapal had just cut through the political theater and reached the raw nerve of American democracy. Her voice, calm yet unflinching, carried a question that should haunt every citizen. How can an agency sworn to uphold the law detain 170 American citizens? It wasn't a rhetorical question. It was an indictment. Moments earlier, the testimony laid bare a pattern of government overreach. ICE agents raiding homes and workplaces, not with precision, but with chaos. Citizens zip-tied and locked in U-Hauls. Children restrained in what was described as a militarized attack. No warrants, no due process, just force, fear, and silence. Jayapal didn't need to raise her voice. Her authority came from the sheer moral gravity of the facts. The lawyer before her described it plainly. These weren't isolated mistakes. They were systemic abuses. A federal agency, armed and empowered by the state, detaining American citizens without cause. A scene that sounds more like an authoritarian nightmare than a democracy. And yet, it's happening here. This is what happens when the machinery of enforcement begins to move faster than the conscience of the law. When national security becomes a shield for misconduct. When the Constitution, meant to be a living promise, becomes a piece of paper ignored in the heat of political fear. In that moment, Jayapal wasn't just asking about ICE. She was asking about us, about the line between protection and oppression, about whether America can still claim to be a nation of laws, or if we've quietly become a nation of exceptions. Her words echoed like a warning. If due process can be suspended for one person, it can be suspended for anyone. If the government can decide, on a whim, who deserves their rights and who doesn't, then no citizen, immigrant or native-born, is truly free. This hearing was more than an oversight session. It was a reckoning. The testimonies painted a portrait of an agency operating in the shadows, unmarked cars, unannounced raids, and a culture of impunity. These were not the images of lawful governance. They were snapshots of fear used as a weapon, power unchecked, and justice ignored. Jayapal's confrontation peeled back the layers of bureaucratic excuses and forced the nation to look directly at the face of its contradictions. America preaches liberty, yet tolerates detention without cause. It celebrates the rule of law, yet excuses those who violate it in uniform. Each example, each citizen wrongfully detained, becomes a scar on the nation's conscience. They are reminders that constitutional rights are not self-sustaining. They must be defended, even from those entrusted to protect them. There was something deeply cinematic about the silence that followed her question. Not the silence of apathy, but the silence that comes when truth enters the room and everyone feels it. The kind of silence that says, "We've gone too far." The testimonies were not just about ICE. They were about what happens when power operates without transparency, when enforcement replaces empathy, when citizens become suspects and suspicion becomes policy. This is not the America that millions believe in, but it is the America that exists when fear dictates governance. The fear of the other, weaponized into raids, detention, and mass surveillance. The fear that divides neighbor from neighbor, all under the banner of security. And yet, amid that darkness, Jayapal's intervention became something else, a call to conscience. Her question, sharp, deliberate, unavoidable, forced us to look inward. If the government can detain citizens today for obstruction, what will it detain them for tomorrow? Protest, dissent, journalism. History tells us that liberty rarely vanishes in one great collapse. It erodes slowly, one warrantless raid at a time, one ignored hearing at a time, one citizen too afraid to speak. That's why hearings like this matter, because sunlight, as Jayapal reminded the nation, is the only true disinfectant. When she said, "We're bringing light to this," it wasn't metaphorical, it was moral. She understood that exposure is power, that naming the injustice is the first act of resistance. This is what democracy looks like when it defends itself. Elected representatives using their voice not for spectacle, but for accountability. Lawyers and activists documenting the truth when others would prefer silence. Citizens realizing that the fight for rights doesn't end at the border. It begins the moment those rights are violated for anyone. In that chamber, amid the fluorescent lights and procedural decorum, something larger stirred. It wasn't outrage alone, it was recognition. Recognition that the erosion of justice anywhere is a threat everywhere. That constitutional violations against one group set the precedent for abuses against all. When Jayapal said, "This violates the rights of everybody," she wasn't exaggerating. She was naming the truth. The constitutional crisis isn't about the number of people detained. It's about the moral direction of a nation that allows it. If the state can confuse suspicion with guilt or mistake citizenship for complicity, then the American experiment is in peril. But if the people, informed, outraged, united, can reclaim the moral ground, then there is still hope. That's what this hearing represents. A reminder that democracy isn't self-sustaining. It must be protected, challenged, and renewed. Not through blind patriotism, but through courage. The courage to confront power with truth. So as the cameras fade and the hearing adjourns, the question remains, who are we? When our government detains its own citizens, what will we tolerate in the name of safety? And how long before silence becomes complicity? The answer depends on what we do next. Because democracy doesn't end when the gavel drops. It continues in the voices that refuse to be silenced. This is the story of power, resistance, and the moral duty to bear witness. This is liberal country, where truth still matters. Subscribe, stay informed, and never stop asking the hard questions.